Now that we have a good idea of the event lifecycle of a component, and we've been introduced to the lifecycle events, or those that we use the most, such as the constructor, the component did mount, component will unmount, component did catch, and then the render, we are now going to dive into finishing up our to-do-item create component, and we're going to learn about how we create event handlers in order to handle events from the JavaScript DOM as they are created by the HTML that comes from our JSX. Now remember, the JSX that we have is very HTML-like, but it's really just a markup language that represents the React JavaScript elements that actually render into HTML in our page as our components get rendered into the HTML page in our single page application. With that, we now need to find out, or we need to see, how we might attach handlers to events on our JSX so that those same events are captured when it happens in the HTML document after it's been rendered to the browser. For that, we're going to go ahead and first we're going to talk about how we might do this. And just like with regular JavaScript, we usually need to have some form of event handler that we will pass as the handler for the events that we're going to be dealing with. Now in this component, we're talking about the create component. So most likely it is going to have a form, and right here we haven't set up the form yet, but we're going to have a form, and inside of that form we are most likely going to have a button. And that button is going to be our submit button. And we are going to want to know, or we were going to want the browser to tell us when our button gets clicked on within our component, so we can then create a new to-do item and let everybody know that a new item was created, have the page updated, have it stored to the database, and then refresh the page to show that new item. To get all of that to happen, we need to handle events. So we're going to handle the submit event of this button, or the on-click event that handles the submission of the potential form that we will have here, and we'll build that in the next screencast. But we're going to focus right here on events. Now events in React are just JavaScript methods that we add to our React component, and in this case it's our to-do item create component. So I'm going to go ahead, and after all of our React methods, these lifecycle methods, I'm going to go down here and let's just add a message that says that these are our custom component event handlers. So custom component event handlers. And I just put that note there just so we can remember that these are custom event handlers. And I'm putting them before the render event because they all, of course, are going to be created before the render happens. And I just like to keep things in the order of execution, as well as separating out React-specific methods or functions, and then our custom ones. Now, it's not a requirement. You can pretty much put it anywhere due to JavaScript's hoisting, but we're going to go ahead and order it this way. All right, so we're handling the click function of this submit button. So let's go ahead and create a new method on our component that will handle this event as it occurs. And for that, we're just going to do let's do a submit handler. I'm just going to call it submit handler. It's going to take in the event, and then we're going to have our code right here that shows that this event happened. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do a console.log in here like we've been doing on the other ones, just so we can see when it gets called. And let's do component event. Oh, let's keep it custom just so we know that this is a custom event. And then we'll say submit button handler. And we'll just show that that submit button handler was called. Now I'm going to show you two different ways to attach this particular handler to a particular set of JSX. And we're going to do that in two different ways so that you can see two different ways that you might run into it when you are dealing with it inside, or when you do any kind of searches in Google and you look through Stack Overflow or you look at documentation, You'll see a couple of different ways, and I want to make sure you know both of them so that you're not confused when you run into that documentation. So let's start out with our submit handler. Now, inside of our component, we can use what are called synthetic events on our JSX components or JSX elements. Now, what I mean by synthetic is that they are not the true DOM events. They are simulated DOM events in the JSX and will be converted to actual DOM events when our JSX gets translated into HTML and gets rendered in the page. And one of those events is the on-click event of a button. And this is the simulated event. And for that, we need to, since we are calling for that event to be handled on this button, we need to provide a handler for that. And we're going to use this submit handler. So we're going to go ahead and tell the button that for the on-click event of this button, when it gets rendered, we want to go ahead and assign the submit handler as our actual handler for that event. We'll go ahead and save it. Now I already have my React app running. I did an npm start on that. So I'm just going to go right over to my browser and we're going to refresh this page. And you can see right here our lifecycle events are firing like we normally do. And when we click on submit, we can see that the submit event is handled with that handler. And we can see our custom event right here with the submit button handler. And every time I click it, we can see that it is being captured by that handler. Now, inside of our submit handler, normally what we're going to do is we're going to update the state in order to hold something, just like we did here inside of our component did catch. And that is most likely going to be the values from this form, or we are going to be making an AJAX request to an API to submit that information to an API. Now, since we don't have an underlying API, we're simply going to update the state with that information just as an example. So right here, let's do this. Let's do this dot set state, and we learned this in an earlier screencast. So this dot set state, and then what we're going to want to set for state are going to be our name and description values from our initial state. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say name, and then let's set it to something. Now we don't have input fields yet, so we're just showing this as demonstration, and we'll get to where we convert those to input fields later. So we're just doing this for demo. Let's do name, and then let's just say updated name. And then let's do our description. And we will call this an updated description. All right. Now with that, we can go ahead and let's go fire our event again and see what happens. It should have already refreshed as soon as React was done recompiling. We'll click submit, and we will see a big fat error. And the error is the fact that this .set state is undefined. Now you might be asking yourself a question here. The submit handler we added as a method of our component, just like we added these methods right here from component did mount, component will unmount, and component did catch, as well as the render and the constructor. Well, all of those functions we actually received from the React component, and we're pretty much just overriding the definition of those methods with our own. Now, since they're already provided by the component and they're already bound to this component object, when we add a new method to our custom React component, and this is a custom method that we're adding, we need to bind it to the component object. And a lot of times people forget this step and then they run into undefines on this and set state. So we need to make sure that we bind our custom event handler to this component. And the way we do that is we do it up here inside of our constructor function, and we bind any custom events that we add to this object. And we do that by simply taking the name of our function that we added, and let's go ahead and put a note here. So binding custom component methods. So all we do is we say this dot, the name of our function as we wrote it down here, so the exact same name, this dot submit handler equals submit handler, oh sorry, we need to do this dot submit handler, this dot submit handler dot bind, and then we pass it this. Now if you remember back to JavaScript, when we talked about this and the fact that this is contextual based on when the code is executed. Therefore, if we're creating a new function, the function's this usually points to the browser window or to the node process if it's running in Node. And because of that, even though this function that we added may be inside of our new component, the problem is that when it gets called in its context, this is actually pointing to the browser. It is not pointing to our to-do item create component. So we need to bind it. And we can do that within the constructor because within the constructor, this actually points to the new to-do item create component instance when it gets executed. And then by binding the submit handler to this component and making sure that we have that set as an actual property on this component, we can now use that. So we're going to go ahead and let React rebuild. Come back to our browser, click submit, and now we don't get that error anymore. We see the submit button handler, that event got fired, and then of course our render event got fired because it wasn't interrupted by an error. And now you can see right here, updated name, updated description. It no longer just says name and description. So you can see that we are now getting that after that event fires, and because in that event is where we add this updated name and updated description. And we can see that set state, and when that set gets state, or when that state gets set, then the component gets redrawn, and we have the updated information, all from that submit. All right. So that is one way of doing it. It's using these virtual or synthetic events on our JSX, which then behind the scenes get compiled into actual JavaScript and DOM events to be handled by our browser when our JSX gets compiled and then inserted in the page as actual HTML with actual compiled JavaScript behind the scenes. Now this is one way of doing it. What I don't like about this way is that we are actually adding events as well as JavaScript into our JSX, and we begin again to muddy the waters when it comes to separation of concerns. I like my JSX to simply describe the user interface for my component, and I don't want to add functionality into it, which is what we're doing right here. We are adding event handlers and event listeners to our JSX within our JSX. I find this to be a poor way to implement that. Before we go any further, I do want to show you one thing. Up here, we did the binding of our new custom event handler up here inside of our constructor. You will see examples. I'm going to comment this out, and you'll see that we'll still have the same error right here. It'll all crash. You will see some people on Stack Overflow or in documentation, you'll see them doing the bind. You'll see them doing it down here inside of the JSX. They'll do it right here, and they will say this.submitHandler.bind. And if we save that, let it rebuild, we can submit it, and you can see that that works. It works with no problem. The issue is that behind the scenes, every time the component has to update and redraw, the request for this particular function inside of our component to be bound to the component, this binding has to happen every single time that our component refreshes. Now, to start out with a simple component, that's really not a big deal, but as your components get more and more complex and you're adding more and more event listeners with more event handlers, and you begin to add all of these binds that have to happen when the JSX gets rendered, it can begin to slow down the rendering of your component because all of this binding of event listeners to event handlers has to happen every time the JSX gets redrawn. And the more times you have to redraw that component with more of those binds happening for a complex component, the slower and slower your particular React component is going to get, which then of course slows down your user interface, which then begins to negatively impact your users. So don't do this. Don't bind your event handlers inside of the onClick event listener inside of your JSX. Not a good idea. The same thing happens here when we use the onClick synthetic event handler inside of our JSX. And even if we get rid of this bind here and we go back to using it the way we had it before, where the bind actually happens inside of our constructor, the same thing happens down here in that every time this JSX has to be recompiled and redrawn every time the state gets updated, this event listener has to be bound to this event handler over and over and over and over again. Again, not quite as bad as the .bind, but when we do this plus the .bind, there's two bindings that have to happen. The handler has to be bound to the component, and then this handler, after bound to the component, then has to be bound to this event listener. My preference is we get rid of all of this in our JSX. We allow our JSX to simply be redrawn as a user interface, and we move the binding of event listeners to event handlers as well as event handlers to the component outside of our JSX. And the way we can do that, it's pretty much the same process, just instead of editing it here inside of our JSX, what we do is we still add our custom handler here, and we still bind it to our component right here, and we still have our custom handler right here. The thing that we do different is that we use what are called React references. React references allow us to reference a component inside of our JSX externally inside of our JavaScript, inside of our component. So here we've got a button, and what we're going to do is we are going to create a React reference to that element, this button element, and then we are going to dynamically add the event listener to that element inside of our component rather than inside of our JSX. And this is how we do that. Here we've got the binding custom component methods, and then let's come down here and let's do getting references to JSX elements. And right under here, we're going to go ahead and get ourselves or create ourselves a reference to that submit button. And the way we do that is we say this dot submit button. Now this is just a name I'm giving it, so I know what element this is, and it's a really simple UI, so we know this is the submit button. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it the submit button. So this is my variable to hold that reference. Then I can say react.create ref, ref. And when we do that, a new reference object is created by React and stored inside of this variable right here. Now, down here inside of our JSX, we simply add a ref property or attribute to this JSX element. We say ref equals, and then within our curly braces, we say this dot submit button. And so now, with this reference, this React ref, being tied to this button, we now have a reference to this button. We don't have to do a document.get element by ID. We don't have to try to search through the HTML to find that particular element. Instead, we're letting React handle keeping a reference to this button for us in our JavaScript. With that, we now have access to this button inside of our component. So now we have our reference to our component that we want to work with. We also have our submit handler bound to this component. And now all we have to do is we have to attach the event, which is of course is our custom submit handler event. And we need to bind that to the particular referenced element or JSX element that we want the event bound to. So here we've got our button, we've got our reference. Now in order for this binding to happen, the component has to be mounted already. And for that, what we're going to do is we're going to use one of those lifecycle events, and we're going to use the component did mount lifecycle event, because once it is mounted, this JSX is all compiled and ready to go, and we will have a reference to that actual JSX element, which will then be converted into HTML. So in here, now we're just going to go ahead and say attach event handlers to referenced element synthetic events. And of course, these are just notes for your reference. Now all we have to do is say this dot submit button dot current, and current gets us the current HTML element. Then we say dot add event listener. We're going to select the click event, which is what we want from that button. And now we're just going to go ahead and give it the handler we want to use, and it's going to go this dot submit handler. And now we have successfully bound the submit handler to the click event of our submit button, all through a React reference. Let's go ahead and see if it worked now that we've got everything all set up. So let's go back to our browser, click submit, and we can see right here we are seeing the submit button handler being fired and then the render getting fired. And the reason why you see the render get fired every time we click this submit button, let's go ahead and clear this really quick so you can see again. Submit, you can see the event fired, submit, fired, submit, fired. That is because inside of our handler, we're using this dot set state, which then updates the state. And with that, once the state goes through its updating process, the component gets re-rendered, which means the JSX gets re-rendered and everything gets reset. Hopefully this helps you understand how to handle events within a React component, how to do it using synthetic events directly on the button, as well as how to use it when we use a React reference to a particular element, and then binding those events to that referenced element using the component didMount lifecycle event. And by doing that, it really clears out your JSX, which is a really good thing, in my opinion, for separation of concerns.